10. The Varangian Guard. The Byzantine Empire maintained an elite bodyguard, known as the Varangian Guard. Unlike local levies, these men were recruited from Northern Europe and Scandinavia. They were prized for their intense loyalty to the emperor rather than local political factions. Historian Snorri Sturluson documented their unique role in protecting the throne. These warriors were often mercenaries who transitioned into the highest tier of imperial security. Their signature weapon was the two-handed Dane axe, capable of splitting shields with ease. They existed outside the complex bureaucratic web of Byzantine court intrigue. This isolation made them the only truly neutral force in the capital. Over centuries, they served as the final line of defense for the Basileus. Their influence on the battlefield was recorded in the Alexiad by Anna Komnene. She described them as fearless and remarkably disciplined in the face of chaos. When the empire grew fragile, the Guard became its only reliable pulse. Yet little remains of their internal training manuals or specific tactical doctrine. They functioned as a closed society within the heart of an ancient superpower. Their existence proves that foreign-born elite units could sustain an empire for centuries. Even after the fall of the empire, their legend persisted in Norse sagas. They were a bridge between the Viking Age and classical civilization. Their story is a reminder of how effectively loyalty can be bought and maintained. 9. The Hashashin. In the mountains of modern-day Iran, the Order of Assassins built a fortress known as Alamut. Founded by Hassan Saba, they operated with terrifying efficiency. They were not a large army, but a surgical tool for geopolitical change. Their name, Hashashin, implies a dedication that defied physical survival. They utilized psychological warfare to paralyze larger political structures. A single operative could influence the fate of a king from miles away. Historians like Marshall Hodgson studied their organizational structure with great interest. They were trained in linguistics, disguises, and patience before ever holding a blade. This was not random murder. It was highly calculated, high-stakes diplomacy. They operated for nearly 200 years under total secrecy. Their methodology suggests a mastery of intelligence gathering centuries ahead of their time. They were feared by both the Crusaders and the regional caliphates. Eventually, the Mongol invasion razed their mountain retreats to the ground. However, their legend persisted, influencing political thought for centuries after their demise. Modern scholars still debate their actual influence on the medieval world. They were an anomaly, an ideological force that challenged the legitimacy of vast empires. By turning personal risk into an institutional weapon, they rewrote the rules of power. They demonstrate how small focus groups can destabilize global titans. Their silence remains the most effective part of their legacy. 8. Winged Hussars. The Winged Hussars were the ultimate expression of heavy cavalry in the 17th century. Originating from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they were masters of the charge. Their signature wings were not mere decoration. They were intended to intimidate and unnerve enemies. These warriors were primarily recruited from the landed nobility, ensuring high investment in training. They used a specialized long lance that outreached any contemporary infantry spear. Their tactical performance at the Battle of Vienna changed the course of European history. Records kept by Jan III Sobieski show they moved with a coordination that seemed almost choreographed. They were not merely charging. They were executing complex maneuvers to break enemy morale. Their armor was light enough for agility, but resilient against musket fire of the era. Despite their fame, the logistical requirements to maintain such a force became unsustainable. As infantry firepower evolved, the era of the shock cavalry slowly faded into obscurity. They left behind a legacy that defines the romantic ideal of the warrior noble. They were a late-period anomaly, surviving long after feudal warfare had supposedly ended. Historians note their unique blend of aristocratic culture and brutal combat efficiency. They represented a pinnacle of human-powered kinetic force on the battlefield. Without their decisive interventions, the geopolitical map of Europe might look vastly different today. Their rapid rise and eventual disappearance mirror the shifting nature of warfare itself. The Immortals were the legendary core of the Achaemenid Empire's military. Herodotus first documented their unique replacement system. Their number was strictly kept at exactly 10,000. If one man died or fell ill, he was immediately replaced to maintain the total. This created an aura of invincibility that demoralized their opponents during the Greco-Persian Wars. They were armed with short spears, bows, and swords, allowing them to adapt to multiple combat environments. Their training centered on extreme endurance and absolute obedience to the King of Kings. Unlike regional militias, they were a full-time state-funded standing army. They wore distinctive robes and wicker shields, which were lighter than the bronze equipment of their Greek adversaries. This equipment allowed them to travel faster and operate in rugged terrain. Their defeat at Thermopylae is often misunderstood. It wasn't a total failure, but a calculated trade-off. They proved that a centralized authority could sustain a military unit through rigid bureaucracy. Over time, their structure was mimicked by various successor states in the Middle East. However, the specific discipline of the original Achaemenid units was rarely replicated. They represent the first instance of a large-scale, professional, mass-produced elite force. Their history is buried in the dust of Persepolis and the fragmented records of antiquity. They remain the blueprint for the modern professional soldier. Every state that has a standing army follows the precedent set by their existence. They prove that consistency is a more lethal weapon than individual bravery. 6. The Mamluks were a paradox of the medieval world, slave soldiers who became sovereign rulers. Originating primarily from the Turkic and Caucasian steppes, they were brought to Egypt as property. Once there, they underwent an intense conversion to Islam and brutal military training. They were forbidden from passing their status to their children, making their system inherently meritocratic. The next generation had to be recruited from abroad, creating a cycle of professional replenishment. This allowed them to rule Egypt and Syria for over 250 years. Their cavalry skills were peerless, utilizing horse archery and lightning-fast flanking maneuvers. Historians often struggle to categorize their hybrid social and military structure. There were masters of a complex, self-renewing system that produced a sovereign caste of warriors. Even after the Mongol invasions, the Mamluks survived by adapting to the enemy's own tactics. Their palace life was refined, acting as patrons of science, architecture, and theology. They were neither fully citizens nor fully slaves, existing in a permanent limbo of absolute power. By the time of the Ottoman conquest, they had become a rigid, almost ritualized military society. Their legacy is an empire built from nothing but combat expertise and strategic assimilation. They show us how a closed, non-hereditary system can persist longer than most dynasties. Their history forces us to redefine the meaning of a professional soldier. They were the ultimate outsiders who mastered the inner workings of power. The Spartan Agoge, the Spartan Agoge, was more than just a training program. It was a state-run psychological experiment. From age 7, boys were removed from their families to be raised by the state. This system turned individual identity into a tool for collective survival. They were taught to endure extreme pain, starvation, and exposure as a rite of passage. Plutarch wrote extensively about the brutal efficiency of this upbringing. The focus was not on individual achievement, but on the flawless execution of the phalanx. By the time they reached adulthood, they were essentially human components of a war machine. Their society relied entirely on a massive slave population, the helots, to function. This created a paradox. The more free a Spartan was, the more dependent they were on control. They rarely produced written manuals, as their doctrine was burned into their physical memory. Their tactical superiority at the Battle of Thermopylae is legendary, yet it was the result of lifelong conditioning. When the population began to decline, the system could not adapt and finally collapsed. It serves as a stark reminder of what happens when a state makes war, its only product. We still study their discipline as a benchmark for elite training programs. Yet, we often ignore the cost to the human spirit in such a system. They were the most successful, and perhaps the most tragic, of all ancient military experiments. The Agoge was a mirror reflecting the extreme priorities of a society that feared anything but its own strength. For the Janissaries. The Janissaries were the elite infantry force that sustained the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Through the Devshirme system, they recruited Christian boys who were raised as elite Muslims and servants to the Sultan. This practice ensured that the military owed allegiance to the state rather than local families. They were the first modern standing army in Europe to rely primarily on firearms. Their discipline was famous. They lived in barracks and were forbidden from marrying during their service. The internal hierarchy was structured around culinary roles, a quirky legacy of their nomadic origins. Historians note that they eventually became a political force that could depose sultans. This influence eventually led to their decay and eventual massacre in the 19th century. They were a fascinating example of how a state can manufacture a loyal military caste. By removing the influence of bloodlines, they built a core of pure institutional loyalty. However, this same isolation eventually turned them into a dangerous, corrupt political bloc. They were a bridge between the medieval knight and the modern soldier. Their training was rigorous, involving complex siege warfare and drill. Their uniform was iconic, and their presence on the battlefield was a symbol of Ottoman dominance. They remind us that the most loyal soldiers are often those with no other home Their rise and fall illustrate the danger of allowing a military branch to become the state itself. The Sacred Band of Thebes remains one of history's most profound anomalies. Composed of 150 pairs of lovers, they were chosen for their unbreakable emotional bond. In 378 BC, they revolutionized Greek warfare by operating as a cohesive, single organism. They didn't fight for abstract territory. They fought to protect the person standing beside them. Their maneuvers at the Battle of Leuctra shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. Ancient historians like Plutarch marveled at their coordination and near-impossible tactics. They operated on a principle of trust that rendered traditional hierarchy obsolete. Because they were trained as pairs, their drills were fluid and almost telepathic in execution. The band was finally annihilated at the Battle of Chaeronea, standing their ground against Philip of Macedon. Even their enemies were reportedly moved by their final disciplined sacrifice on the field. They proved that emotions can be weaponized into a force multiplier more potent than simple training. Yet their existence was folded into silence by later powers who feared their model. No monuments were raised, and their tactical manuals were never widely preserved. They are a ghost in the machine of history, a reminder of what humanity can do when connection is prioritized. Their disappearance reflects a systemic fear of units that operate outside the standard command chain. We are still uncovering the fragments of their story from scattered manuscripts. They stand as a testament to the power of human bonds in the face of absolute destruction. Tuo, the Mongol Keshig. The Keshig was the imperial guard of the Mongol Empire, personally loyal to Genghis Khan. They functioned as a school for the empire's next generation of leaders. Membership was not just a military role, it was a path to the highest levels of administration. They were masters of the composite bow, able to shoot with lethal accuracy at extreme ranges. Unlike standard units, they were trained in diverse roles: cooks, horse tenders, and personal bodyguards. This created a versatile force that could solve any problem in a mobile empire. They represented a total shift in military thinking. The Guard was the government. Historians like Rashid al-Din have detailed their organization into day and night watches. Their existence proves that elite units can serve as the brain of an entire civilization. They operated without the baggage of feudal class structures, valuing merit above all else. Their tactical doctrine was based on extreme mobility, feigned retreats, and psychological domination. The Keshig were the reason the Mongol Empire stayed intact during the expansion phase. They remain the most successful example of a meritocratic elite force in human history. After the empire fragmented, the system was absorbed by various regional dynasties. Their legacy is the speed and organizational genius of the Mongol military machine. They show us that power is most effective when it is shared with a select, highly competent core. Their story is a blueprint for organizational agility that we still emulate today. 1. The Nubian Medjay. The Medjay of ancient Egypt are the world's first true professional scouts and police force. Originating from the Nubian region, they were initially employed as border guards and scouts for the pharaohs. Their knowledge of desert survival and tracking was unmatched by any army of their time. Over centuries, they evolved into an elite security service protecting royal tombs and major cities. They were feared for their ability to navigate harsh terrain where no organized army could follow. Unlike heavy phalanx units, they were experts in light infantry and covert operations. The New Kingdom records frequently mention them as the unseen eyes of the crown. They represent the first time an entire culture was effectively hired for specialized state security. Their integration into Egyptian society shows a sophisticated approach to multicultural military service. They were not just soldiers, they were the guardians of the social order. Yet their unique status also created friction, as they stood apart from the native Egyptian population. This separation made them perfect for internal security, as they had no local political ties. They demonstrate how professionalized foreign expertise can stabilize a central authority. Even today, they appear in modern media as the archetypal elite desert guard. Their disappearance was slow, as their identity gradually faded into the broader Egyptian population. They remind us that the most reliable guard is often someone from the outside. Their story is the ultimate example of state-sponsored professional security. They helped build an empire that stood for 3,000 years.